Anna Llewellyn-Smith is an English for academic purposes tutor at Harper Adams University. Anna, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking with you today. Thank you so much for joining me. Could you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Well, I'm delighted to be part of this podcast as well, because I think the topic we want to discuss is important. I am, as you've mentioned, a tutor at Harper Adams University, which is a specialist agricultural university in Shropshire. And my role within the university is to support all our international students or anyone within the university, whether they're home students as well, that their language, their first language is not English. So that would include Welsh speakers as well. So we support students in helping them write their assignments, direct them to resources. We run one-to-one tutorials to offer support for thesis writing and various things. And we run workshops and classes that they can generally improve their English to support their studies.
That sounds like quite a wide-ranging role, both in terms of the cohorts, if you like, of students that you're supporting, and the amount of different work you have to do in terms of the support that students require. In your experience, what are some of the communication challenges that students face at university?
I would say, particularly with Chinese students, and the majority of our international intake is of Chinese students, their main problems is communicating verbally in English. Many of these students are very bright, they're very well qualified in their subject areas before they come, particularly postgraduates, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their language proficiency matches their academic ability. Um, and so some of the main barriers is communicating their knowledge. And while they might be able to write well academically, especially with AI tools these days and translation tools, communicating at conferences and seminars and group works, or even understanding their lectures, listening and interacting with their tutors, is proving a barrier. Um, and so really that's what tweaked my interest in working out how we could investigate this further and hopefully put in place some measures that would mitigate the struggles that some of these students were having.
So we're saying that there are, you said, a number of things which are really interesting, but communicating verbally can be quite a challenge for some students. And understanding lecture content
Yes.
would be another area. If you're thinking about communicating verbally in higher education settings, I'm just thinking, because I am more or less a monolingual speaker of English. I did a little bit of French at school. I did some Zulu when I worked in South Africa, not very well. But I'm able to communicate in English pretty much wherever I go. What is it like in your experience on an emotional level for people who are struggling to communicate in an education setting when they actually know what they're talking about? What is that like?
I feel for students, I really do, because I'm in the same position as you. I can't claim to have any other languages under my belt. I've got token snippets of a couple of languages, but nothing to speak of. And in my own experience as well, not being able to communicate your ideas. You have your ideas, they're fully formed in your head, but you can't communicate them adequately or at the particular level that's required, is very isolating. It's quite humiliating in some senses, especially at postgraduate level when you've got to discuss quite complex concepts sometimes with supervisors or theses committees or something like that. And I think it erodes confidence and it stops you flourishing. And that's why people have come to be able to perform at their best. And people are denied, if you can't communicate adequately, you're denied the full student experience for which you're sometimes paying quite a lot of money to benefit from. So I think those are the primary things that I would pick up on. It impacts socially too. Joining clubs and societies or interacting with home students so that you can benefit from a British or a UK cultural experience as well. So you're you're denied having a complete experience, really. You're only getting a very thin written academic experience if you can't communicate adequately. And finding friends or integrating or considering staying on after your studies and being employed in Britain, the implications are quite significant, really.
I think from what you're saying on a personal and emotional level, this is something that's likely to be causing huge distress and alienation and isolation for students. This feeling of being unable to communicate. And it's really terribly sad to hear it. What's interesting to me is that you've referred a couple of times to students at postgraduate level. So am I right in thinking these are not students who have generally a terribly low level of English? Because presumably to be admitted for postgraduate study in UK higher education, you have to pass English language exams at a reasonably high level to get in the first place. Or am I wrong in thinking that?
No, you do. And Harper's is quite strict, um, that they meet all their Home Office visa requirements before they take students on. And there's quite a filtering process that goes on. But even if you have, and this is particularly the case with the Chinese undergraduates, even if you have sufficient levels of English because of the international tests that you've done, they don't necessarily adequately equip you to communicate fully in all the spheres that you might find yourself in. So you might be able to write academically sufficiently well. You've proved your intellect, you're up to scratch, you've got the right background. But if you can't communicate those ideas adequately verbally or understand them through listening, you are particularly hindered. I I think they have what it takes, but these examinations don't sufficiently test their social English, listening to normal speed English. It's all very contrived. Some of these exams are very contrived, so they're not necessarily experience an authentic situation. A lot of the students that we get, their educational background has allowed them to have access to English lessons, and they do have a certain level of proficiency, generally, like we do from our schooling. But sometimes their exposure to authentic English, native speakers, um, communication at speed, normal speed, all the nuances that come with understanding a second language, aren't necessarily in place. And so the limitations are quite subtle. It's not about not literally having the grade. Those grades don't allow you to fully function.
So when we're thinking about native speaker English and exposure to authentic English, and we're saying that the exams may not provide a sufficient background in that for students to be confident in
Mm,
speaking and verbalizing their thoughts. I'm trying to put myself in the position of a student who is networking at an academic
mm,
conference or making small talk with a PhD supervisor or an
mm,
academic tutor in a semi-formal setting. And those settings are really very important for social
mm.
cohesion and for integration and academic success. What potential problems might I cause, as a native speaking tutor, trying to communicate, let's say, with a Chinese undergraduate or a Chinese postgraduate who's less confident in their use of English?
Some of the barriers that you would be putting in the way potentially would be the use of idioms, an instinctive use of idioms. They are so prevalent in all languages. Um, and you have to be very proficient as a second language speaker to have got to grips with the idioms of another language. That's quite an advanced stage of proficiency. So idioms are quite a barrier. They're significant. And if we are to dissect our dialogue, we would find that we're using them regularly without even knowing in many cases. They are so ingrained and so integral to our everyday discussions that we're not even conscious of them sometimes. Another problem is that we're often talking about unfamiliar concepts or unfamiliar content, such that the student not only has to understand the language, they have to additionally get their minds around the new ideas. And sometimes, even in your own language, a new idea, especially at an undergraduate level, is enough to contend with, let alone having to translate that, retranslate it back and articulate that concept in a second language. That's a tall order. That's a tall order for anybody. Technical terms, I think we sometimes just band around technical terms which are alien and new and definitely not part of entry requirements or parts of the exams and tests that students might have taken before they arrived. Our intonation is key. If we don't suggest meaning through the fluctuations of our voice, we are not helping students navigate meaning. So if we're monotone, they can't separate out key points or key ideas because we're not indicating what those key ideas might be with our voices. And our voices and our facial expressions play a large part in communication. And the words that we speak form only a fraction of the message. So much of the message is communicated by what we call in our world paralinguistic features, all the gesturing and the facial expressions. And we subconsciously pick up a lot of meaning from gesturing and facial expressions together with the pattern of our voices. So people trying to communicate with undergraduates and postgraduates who are operating in a second language need to be mindful of how helpful it can be if you do employ gesturing and you do become mindful of the pattern of your voice and how powerful a tool that is, really, in communicating your message. I think we have to be mindful if we've got a strong accent. A lot of students have really only heard what I suppose we would describe traditionally as received pronunciation. And so to hear a strong Scottish accent, for example, that can be quite challenging. And sometimes, even as native speakers, if we come across somebody from Britain who's got a very particular strong regional accent, let's say, we find ourselves listening particularly hard as well. So, and that's as native speakers. So imagine how that compounds the problem if you are operating in a second language. Word stress plays another key part in communicating our messages as well. And I know that Chinese students, having quizzed them, really would appreciate if their lecturers were to use word stress to indicate key words, key technical terms, key ideas. Because like intonation, it's part of navigating the meaning, and you are relying on all these factors to understand what's being said. Another factor I think that is a barrier is if we don't indicate where the conversation or the discourse is going next. And if we don't sufficiently use discourse markers, so those are the terms of my final point, moving on, next, firstly, because we're not indicating, now you must listen. This is the final point that I'm going to make. This is the concluding argument. And they're signposts, aren't they? This is where I'm going next. This is, you must listen up. This indicates that the key idea is coming now. And when you're listening, and potentially you've got listening fatigue because it's jolly hard work, listening intently all the time, anything that can help you prepare and navigate for the next part of that discourse is hugely helpful to students. I know too that when you survey or question students, it isn't necessarily a point that comes out obviously in conversation, but it has come out, this idea from sitting down and having students in focus groups and things. The speed at which we talk is perhaps one of the biggest barriers of all. Not necessarily statistically, but sort of embedded in how they feel. When we know our material, when we're slightly nervous or we're giving a presentation, our speed gets faster. Any accents that we have become more pronounced. And a student operating in a second language, if that language is very fast, they're so preoccupied with keeping up that they can't hold on to the key points. And obviously in their brains, they are hearing it, processing it, translating it into their native languages, translating it back, getting on top of what that means, by which the point has gone. It's so very, very difficult to stay abreast of ideas if that person is talking, I suppose, at normal conversational speed. And as you'll know, when we talk at speed, we become lazy and we clip words, we fuse sounds together. So what is clear and articulated when we speak slowly almost can become sounding like a different language at speed. And if we can speak at a speed where all those sounds are clear, you are really helping students recognize the words that they've probably come upon before, but not at speed, clipped and edited, as what happens when we chatter away at normal native speak. And of course, it's happening in their own languages, but this is, they're accustomed to that and their brains are attuned to operating in their native language. You're just asking them to do enormous feats, really, in a second language.
There's so much in what you say there, and thank you for sharing your expertise. So, rate of speech is one key factor that can help us as native speakers become more intelligible. Avoiding idioms, these fixed expressions like we use, like they're going out of fashion, is another thing that can be problematic. And you were saying about gestures and the paralinguistic features, so body language and facial expressions to help people navigate the discourse. And I suppose you were saying almost structuring the discourse as you might hopefully in a lecture. First, I'd like to talk about this. My second point is this. And finally, my last point is XYZ, to give people chance to pace themselves. I think what you were saying about the mental overload of operating in a second language is really interesting, just how tiring it must be to have to concentrate for an extended period. And in fact, we're talking about a 24/7 period, really, with students that come to the UK, which makes your point about vocabulary use particularly relevant, because it must be exhausting anyway to operate in a second language. But if the subject matter is also new and the vocabulary is highly specialized. And that again is something that we as native English speakers, higher education staff could be very mindful of. Clearly, you have a lot of expertise and experience in this field, but just a very simple question, I hope. This is your specialist areas, so you're dealing with students, I'm guessing, on a one-to-one basis who have particular problems, and this will stand out in your mind. But without being rude to you, Anna, is it really that big a problem? Or are we talking about some isolated cases that
No,
you are?
the literature supports this. It's been an issue for some decades, but the focus has often been on imagining or perceiving those barriers from a teacher or a practitioner perspective. And very few studies have been done quizzing the students themselves. Any studies that have been done prior to translation tools, prior to lectures being recorded, so students can access that before a lecture perhaps. And so they're quite dated. And I think the problems, especially with translation tools and things, the problem is navigable to some extent with translation tools and things like that. But the nature of the problem is shifting. But the gravity of the problem remains the same. And it affects huge swathes of international students, really at all levels. And another problem that a lot of students have is that very often they're coming for a final year of their degree, or they're coming for a one-year master's course, and the adjustment time isn't really sufficient. I have noticed students that come for 2 years, their final 2 years of a degree course, are much better able to handle their final year because you can see that adjustment happening. It happens fairly rapidly, but it doesn't happen sufficiently in 12 months. And a huge number of our students come just for the final parts of degrees. Not all students come for a 3-year degree or 4-year degree course
And I
from
think that
overseas.
particularly relates back to what you were saying about the issues that postgrad experiences
Yes.
experience when an awful lot of master's degrees are
Yeah.
1 year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if it's going to take 12 months to fully, not fully, if it's going to take 12 months
Adequately.
to
Yeah.
adjust and acclimatize to the language, the
Mm.
accent, the speed, the idioms, the vocabulary, that is a huge demand to be put on people. I know that you've been working on some research at Harper Adams University looking at communication challenges that students face. Could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes, well, I was very troubled. I have been for a good while. I've been teaching at Harper's for 13 or 14 years. And throughout that time, it's something that I was noticing was an issue. And fairly recently, I got the opportunity to do some action research, and I knew immediately what I wanted to do it on, because finally I could address this issue that had been plaguing me. It was particularly triggered by students telling me repeatedly that they only understood about half of their lecture content in live lectures. And that was quite shocking. And chatting to students, I discovered that they were doing all sorts of things to try and navigate that problem. So they were spending a lot of time before lectures trying to read the PowerPoints that were posted on their various module pages beforehand, trying to understand the vocabulary, getting out their translators in the lecture, busy reading the translation tools, which aren't always accurate beforehand. And I thought, gosh, this is crazy. We need to find really what the problem is. Let's dissect this problem properly and see what are the particular issues. Ask students, not imagine, ask students what they felt were some of the solutions that staff could do to ease their passage through their experience at the university. So the moment I got clearance to do this action research, off I set. And I sent out a questionnaire to the final year cohort of Chinese students that we had had that particular year. And I got a very good response rate. I got a 60% response rate from these questionnaires. And these are students that are just completing their final year at Harper Adams. So they are under that stress of having to adjust so quickly and accommodate everything in just that 12 months. And the questionnaire had a selection of multiple choice questions, closed questions, Likert scale questions, and a couple of open-ended questions at the end. And in addition to that, I organized 2 focus groups with volunteer students who came and talked to me then in more depth about some of the things that they were facing. And we've discussed already some of the results that they came out with, that they articulated what the issues were. But interestingly, and I think more importantly, they came up with a list of things that staff could do to make life easier. And those are the things that we need as an institution, and possibly more widely across HE or other language setups, is to implement. They are small, they are manageable, there's almost no excuse. It's just being mindful that the tiniest tweaks to delivery that are going to have a fundamental impact on that student's experience and their ability to maximize their time here and get the best grades that they've come and seeking. And some of the suggestions, which we sort of touched on already, were hand gestures, facial expressions, slow down that speaking speed. Other things like highlighting topic sentences and keywords on PowerPoint slides, something very simple. Allowing students to record the lecture. Sometimes, that might be a bit of an issue, or online lecturing or on delivery, but that they can go back, dissect that lecture, pause it, stop it, translate it, repeat it. So that's a huge help for them. Another suggestion they came up with is if staff could provide a glossary of technical terms ahead of any delivery so that they can be conversant with those terms for when they hear them. They already know the meaning of them. And in some subject areas, the technical terminology is numerous. It's delivery is littered with them. So that would help people avoid those idioms and colloquialisms, really emphasize intonation and stress to reinforce key points, and any video clips that are provided, that English subtitles accompany them so that they can listen and read at the same time. And I can understand that. I suppose it's the difference between what our brains are required to do when we watch television, when we're watching and seeing that message and all those paralinguistic features, versus listening to the radio. It's a different sort of experience. So that if you can see the words simultaneously, you can navigate the content much more easily. My study revealed really that these barriers are real. They're really real.
Well,
And
that finding that you, sorry to interrupt you, Anna, but the finding you mentioned at the beginning of this section, where these final year students were saying they cannot understand 50% of lecture content. That's huge.
It's huge. And it's not, those aren't isolated comments. Those are consistently reported to me.
Yeah.
And so I found in my own teaching that not only are we trying to do English for academic purposes, I could see there was a need for functional English and social English to be woven in as well, because their lecture content and interacting with lecturers in tutorials and things is huge. It's a big part of what they do. Just the academic content is only part of what they need to take on board.
And what was quite striking as well, I agree with you, this is absolutely fundamental. From the way you were describing these student experiences and the responses to the research you were doing, we're not talking about students that can't be bothered to get out of
No,
bed, turn up late, hungover,
no,
exhausted, demotivated. Oh, I couldn't understand half of
no.
that. Well, you need to pull your finger out then, don't you?
Yeah,
Because you were saying that they are going through the PowerPoints in advance. They are trying to use translations during the lectures. I'm guessing they're getting together in groups afterwards to try
yep,
and fathom out what on earth was going on. They are making an effort, and
exactly.
still 50% of this
Yes.
is inaccessible.
I know from what students have told me that for every hour of content lecture delivery, they are spending 2 hours understanding that lecture recording afterwards.
Wow.
So compared to home students, they are certainly doing their bit to cope. Added to which, families are paying an awful lot of money for students to attend a UK university. There's huge motivation to do well. They're very motivated, the undergraduates, to go on and make themselves very employable. A lot of them are keen to carry on and stay in UK and do master's degrees. So they are certainly very motivated, and I would claim working very hard, if not harder, than our home students in just reaching the starting line. It's not a level playing field at all. So, yes, we're not talking about people who can't get out of bed. We're talking about very motivated, very bright students who have certainly done well to get here, to pass all those hurdles, have got the necessary entry requirements in terms of academic grades and language grades, and still it's an issue, 50%. And I find that quite troubling.
It's staggering. It's
Mm,
absolutely staggering. And it's interesting what you're saying about the level of motivation and the additional work that these
mm,
international students are having to
mm,
undertake in order to accomplish their degrees. To my mind, and certainly in my experience as an English language teacher, I think these problems can go underreported precisely because international students, students who speak English as a second language, they often take all the responsibility onto themselves
mm-hmm.
because of that motivation, because of the family finances involved in
Yes.
sending them here, and that absolute need to succeed at all
Mm-hmm.
costs. And so rather than complain and say that lecture is not good enough, that
Mm-hmm.
seminar was conducted too quickly, that vocabulary wasn't
Mm.
explained, students will tend to think, well, it's my fault,
Yes.
it's my responsibility, I will just stay up
Mm-hmm.
all night
Mm-hmm.
in order to be able to understand in the same way that a home
Mm-hmm.
student could within
Mm-hmm.
about 30 minutes. And so I think the problem goes underreported,
Mm-hmm.
which is where the work you've done becomes so interesting in bringing this to light.
I think in addition to that, there's also cultural elements and educational experience. So in some cultures, for example, in Chinese culture, you wouldn't readily challenge the teacher. You wouldn't readily use up class time asking questions. So Chinese students are less likely to indicate that they're struggling. Added to which, a lot of these Chinese are joining modules where there's the majority are home students. So the lecturer doesn't necessarily get a feel for what the international students are experiencing because they're sort of almost lost in the mass. I'm very privileged in the sense that in my role, we see them one-to-one and quite intensively. And we run language classes where there are only Chinese students in there. So you do get to hear much more so than general lectures, what their issues are. Um, and you can completely forgivable. A lecturer doesn't necessarily know all the linguistic issues a second language learner is experiencing if you're delivering an engineering lecture or a food lecturer. Why should you? How should you? Your professional experience hasn't necessarily led you down that path. So I feel why this research might be useful is spreading the message that these small little adjustments that can be made by all of us, irrespective of our training or our subject areas, are going to help all our students, irrespective of whether actually they are international or not. Because other research has shown that some of these recommendations also apply to students with special learning differences. And so we're addressing everybody. By making these adjustments, you're making life better for anyone who is in front of you.
I
And
was
so I
thinking
think
when
that
you were
becomes even more prevalently important, really.
yes, I mean, I was thinking when you were mentioning some of your recommendations for improving communication, such as structuring the dialogue and making clear the different phases of
Mm-hmm.
the dialogue that you intend to conduct, that seems to me to be applicable to a much wider range of students than only international
Mm-hmm.
students. I began to think, as you were talking about universal design principles for
Mm-hmm.
learning and how much it actually relates to that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that you're saying, we should be doing for all students.
Absolutely.
Everyone would benefit. And it's interesting you say that the changes required, the changes you suggest that lecturers might implement, are actually fairly small in terms of how we do it. They might take a bit of thought, a bit of practice
Mm-hmm.
initially, but they're fairly small. How have your recommendations been received by members of staff when you shared your findings with them?
Very positively.
Good.
Certainly, Harper Adams has a mindset of being receptive to change. And it's an environment where ideas are very freely shared. And there are plenty of forums and opportunities to do that at Harper. So it's a wonderful environment in that sense. So I have delivered various workshops and teaching and learning conferences and things that we have regularly, and shared these. And people have been very, very keen to find out how they can improve. I think an interesting study would be then to go and follow up and see, while the intention might be there, whether actually it's filtering through now as commonplace. I am confident that it will and does, and increasingly become of the way we operate, because Harper's is very well, takes inclusivity and the student experience very seriously. But I think the problem has been that under that umbrella of accessibility and inclusivity, language gets overlooked. So we're trying to address people from ethnic minorities or students with disabilities, making accommodations for them. But language isn't really part of people's thinking. And it's surprising that the accommodations and the modifications that are required in language are so simple. It's, and we can seem to manage the bigger things. So we can definitely manage these tinier things that are going to make just as much a difference, I think.
I know in our work in diversity and inclusion in the corporate world, language has been called the most neglected field in management for
Oh, I can
exactly
believe
the
that.
same reasons that you're mentioning, that many other accommodations, which are actually, they're important, but are harder, more
Yeah.
expensive, and more time consuming to implement, these will be addressed. But simpler, smaller, cost effective, faster changes to the way we speak, the way we communicate, tend to be overlooked, perhaps because we take it for granted, or the message
Mm.
that we need to change simply hasn't got out there, hasn't been propagated. So it's interesting what you say, that this applies potentially within higher education as well.
And we must remember that those adjustments and accommodations that we're thinking of in terms of language, to go back to our previous point, benefits everyone.
Yeah.
Accommodations that we might make for disabled students or students with certain impairments are relevant to those students. But this language adjustment is relevant to everybody. So it's a very efficient adjustment, really, that we can be making, because it covers the whole population of our students. So why not?
And going back to your point at the beginning, when we were thinking about the negative effects of failing to adjust language and the problems of communication, and you were saying just how demoralizing this can be, not just in academic settings, but socially, in terms of joining clubs and the whole university experience. Small adjustments to language, effective adjustments to language, the potential positive impact across university life is huge from what you're saying.
And also in terms of retention, in terms of success, and the level of degrees people come away, their intention to study further, their prospects of remaining in UK and adding to the economy and bringing their cultural knowledge and diversity and all the other positive things that international students bring. They don't just bring a check to finances. They bring so much more to Britain. So yeah, we need to take it seriously, and we need to just do it. The accommodations are so straightforward, and as you said, they're free. They don't cost anything. They just cost a little bit of pre-thought in the planning and the delivery of something. And you're fundamentally making the difference between something being inaccessible and accessible.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today, Anna. Thank you so much for joining me.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.